Hi everyone, and welcome to the final video of my 5-part video series where I break down the results of my PhD and make them more accessible to everyone in esports. This study and this video will focus on the psychology of elite e-athletes. It was probably the hardest study I did, close to the biggest, but definitely one of the most rewarding. I'm really proud of this, and I hope you get some great takeaway learnings from this. Let's jump in. Final time you'll hear me say this, I'm not a registered psychologist. The content of this video should not be used instead of seeking professional help. If you're having mental health issues and you're struggling, don't suffer in silence. Please reach out. Let's get me out of the way. This is the final study of my PhD. It was a qualitative analysis, meaning we didn't really use numbers. The data collected was all interviews and voice recordings. A qualitative analysis of the perceived determinants of success in professional esports athletes, and I'll break down that mouthful in a second. This paper is published, links in the description below. Okay, let's get me back up on screen. What was the aim of this research? Well, I'm going to spend a bit of time on this slide because we wanted to do something different here. So many of you who play esports and who have watched my last 4 videos will be going, you've just taken what they've done in traditional sports and you've tried to see if that works in esports, and you found that some of it does and some of it doesn't. You're 100% correct. I wanted to flip that view on its head. I wanted to come at esports from an exploratory perspective, without presumptions, without assumptions. We wanted to ask the best esports players that I could talk to, what do you think makes you successful psychologically? Forget traditional sport, forget mental toughness, forget stress and coping. What do you think makes you elite in esports? To do that, we used this model. It's called the bioecological model of human development. It was simplified for this video. But we did that so that we could capture as many elements of high performance as we could. So we asked about proximal processes, so their training processes. We asked about the person, so their characteristics, and that was specifically really interesting to me in sports psychology, about their mindset. And then we asked about the context that they perform in, specifically the team context. So the bioecological model guided the questions that I asked in the interview, just to make sure that I wasn't focusing on something I wanted to find. We used a really broad model. But the main point on this slide is that this was completely exploratory. No influences from traditional sport. We just wanted to hear from e-athletes what makes you successful. How did we do that? Well, I've already alluded to it, but we used semi-structured interviews. Using 3 out of the 4 of those components of the bioecological model. We weren't interested in time because this isn't a developmental study. I'm not going to go into that in any more detail. The interviews lasted between 37 and 84 minutes, so we have so much data, which is what made this study so big and so hard to analyze. Is so much data came from these elite athletes. Questions that I asked them, for example, if you're wondering, were give me an example of when you were playing really well. And so they would tell me about when I was at this LAN, I was unstoppable. And then I'd drill down on that. Well, what about your mindset? What about, and you'll see those reflected in the results that I put up on screen in the next 5 minutes. Another example was, what are the challenges of working in esports teams? So exploring those contexts. What's hard about what you do? What are you trying to overcome? Because me as a researcher and sports psychologists and team managers, we need to know what the challenges are for you elite athletes so we can overcome them. And if you're a competitive player and you're also experiencing these challenges, well, then you know you're experiencing similar challenges to the elite players. Who are my participants? Well, we interviewed 7 high-performing elite esports athletes from across Rainbow Six Siege, Overwatch, Counter-Strike, and League of Legends. And when I say elite, I'm actually very proud of the sample we were able to collect in this study. At the time of recording, one of the players was the 4th best at their chosen esport in the world. I can't name names. That's not how research works. Every player each of these 7 players was in the top 20, whether that's in the top 20 teams or the top 20 players in the world at their chosen esport. So when we say elite, we mean really, really elite. Every one of the players has won multiple tournaments at the national level. They're all playing at the international level. I am so proud and so grateful that these elite e-athletes would give me their time. How do we analyze the data? This is not for the players listening. This is more for the sports psychologists, just to know that we analyzed it properly. We did thematic analysis and we followed Braun and Clark 2016, 2019, and 2021. We did it in Vivo, which is a software for doing these kind of analyses, and we conducted qualitative measures of rigor. If you're a player, don't concern yourself with that. The main thing you need to know to verify the validity of this research is that it's published in the Journal of Sports Sciences, which is a very high-ranking journal. Just like all the studies in my PhD, and all of them are published, these results were verified by 2, if not more, independent experts in the field. So why I'm telling you this is that it's not just I wanted to find what I wanted to find and I went out and found it. I conducted a scientific process throughout these interviews that was verified by other scientists who are experts in this field, and they said this was done to a high enough quality to be published in this high-ranking journal. So just keep that in mind. I'm trying to remove my biases from this research. So what did we find? Well, the thematic analysis, so those 7 interviews that lasted between 37 and 80 minutes, 60 minutes was the average. I went through them line by line, which is the thematic analysis process I detailed on the last slide. And from that came 401 codes that were categorized into 12 lower order themes and 3 higher order themes. Now, the 3 higher order themes aligned with the model that I used to conduct this investigation. So for person, that was experiences of playing well. Proximal process, this was all about players training. And for context, this was all about esports teams. So the results that I'm going to break down for the rest of the video are talking about the mindset of elite e-athletes when they're playing well. You want to try and replicate that if you're a competitive player. If you're a sports psychologist or a support staff, you want to help your players have these experiences at the highest level. We're going to break down how elite e-athletes train so you can upskill your training if you're a player looking to get better. And if you're a team manager or org owner listening to this, you can go, am I implementing all of these practices? Am I supporting my players to do all of these things? Because this is what the best in the world do. And lastly, we talked about esports teams. And for all the same reasons as the last 2 higher order themes, that's very important to understand. So let's jump in. This slide is a lot, and I'm going to break it down on this slide and the next slide, and I'm going to go through them as clearly and as concisely as I can. Under experiences of playing well, there was the high performance mindset. So this details what is going on in the athlete's head when they're performing. What is the high performance experience for these players? These were things like flow states, being in the zone. What are some of the strategies that these elite e-athletes used? And a lot of these were coping strategies, things like rhythmic breathing, performance behaviours. So how do these players warm up? What behaviors do they implement when they're playing well? These are all detailed in more depth in the paper, and I'll talk about them on the next slide. And what is it? What is the player's attitude towards playing well? We saw so much confidence. These players had trained rigorously. They believed they were going to win. They had a game plan. They were going to execute that game plan. When we asked about challenges to playing well, funnily enough, a series of stresses and stressful situations come up, further validating the last 3 studies and the last 3 videos. And we elaborate on those in the paper as well. Ineffective performance strategies. So these were things that the players tried to do that didn't work. Some of them tried certain mindfulness strategies. Some of them tried certain things that just did not work. And lastly, what are the negative emotions that they experienced? This was really interesting because, again, that ties into the stress and coping process. Proximal process. So training. What was their training environment like? How did they go about gaining knowledge? What were their attitudes towards training? As in, when they were training, what were they thinking? What were they trying to get from that training? And lastly, context. So when in esports teams, what were the main challenges of teams? And some of you are going to be going, well, that's going to align with the stress and coping research that you've already done. You're spot on. And we explain more about the coach athlete relationship and how important or not important, or the differences between players with their coach athlete relationship. Okay, so let's jump in and break each one of these results down. So the findings from study 4 for the performance mindset during play. If you're getting a bit lost with where all of these are, just jump back to that slide or have a screenshot of that slide, or you could even get the paper up and follow along with what I'm talking about. But you shouldn't need to. I'm going to get myself off this. So performance mindset during play. Players reported that they felt focused and in the zone. They reported flow states. And this is not a word I put in their mouth. This is what they reported. Flow states, focus, and confidence were reported by elite athletes. If you're trying to push to that next level or improve your esports performance, you need to try and get in flow states. You need to remove distractions and remain focused. Players also reported feeling an unshakable self-confidence in their ability to win a round, regardless of the situation. They knew they were not going to die this round. They knew they were going to win. Now that is very similar to the description of mental toughness, and that actually supports the previous video in the importance of mental toughness in esports performance. Jumping on to mental performance strategies. Now, most of the mental performance strategies that were reported were around regulating emotions. So this supports that emotion-focused coping strategy importance that we found in study 2. Players reported actively trying to calm down when they noticed themselves becoming emotionally dysregulated, and they would need to mentally reset. And they said that they did this to avoid tilt or when they were feeling high levels of anxiety. So again, showing the importance of emotion-focused coping strategies, avoiding letting tilt and anxiety take control of us. Performance behaviors. This was again in relation to tilt and increased levels of anxiety. They reported using breathing techniques. So slow, deep breaths were reportedly used when players felt nervous or anxious and when they were trying to mentally reset from a stressful situation like losing a round or making a big mistake. And this was done either during the round or post-playing. Another performance behavior that came up was taking tactical breaks. Take a quick break from the game, change your environment, stand up, walk around, have a drink of water, do something to break up the potential monotony of just sitting and playing and getting stuck in that rut. Stressors, my favorite thing. Apparently, a major stressor that was reported by these elite athletes was breakdown in teammate communication. This has been reported in all of the studies that a breakdown in teammate communication is a serious cause of stress for all players. And we touch again on this teammate communication breakdown when we go and we talk about esports context in a few slides and teams. Ineffective performance strategies were over communicating. So what players reported doing was that when they were feeling stressed and they were trying to help the team when they didn't know how they could, is that they'd find themselves over communicating, or they'd identify their teammates as over communicating. Too much information, telling their teammates that I'm watching this angle that was actually an irrelevant angle. So try to identify that in yourself, or calmly bring that up and politely bring that up with your teammates when you think they're stressed, and help them notice their stress behaviors. Negative emotions that came up were almost all related to tilt: anger, annoyance, frustration. These were the negative emotions that were being experienced, and this supports the previous studies and the previous videos in this series. That tilt is a big issue. Emotional dysregulation is a big issue in esports, and something that we need to work on as players and work with as support staff. The training environment. So the paper's results actually detail this in more depth, but it outlines the mode, how, frequency, how often, intensity, and duration, how long esports athletes are training. What they're doing in their training environment. So the biggest way that esports go about training that isn't actually playing is watching other pro games. And this is both in the region that they were competing in and in international regions, so they could see what North America or EU or the Asian regions were doing and what their metas were, and making sure they were keeping up with it. Surprisingly, another way of training was reviewing their own footage. If you're a competitive player and you're trying to push to that next level, you need to be recording your play. You need to be reviewing your play and figuring out where you could have gone better, what mistakes you were making. You have to do that as well as watching how the best people are playing. When they were actually training, they were playing their game, they were playing competitively. They were training between 2 and 5 times a week, specifically for aim training for first-person shooters. And other players were training 2 to 7 days a week. So in some of our MOBAs and other titles. As well as this 2 to 7 days a week of team training, they were also solo training 3 to 7 days a week. So this is a serious amount of training. This is a hard profession to chase after, and this is what the elite players are doing to make sure they remain at the top. Intensity, so how hard are these athletes training? And this also ties into the attitudes towards trainings, was between 60 and 90%. And this is depending on the opponent and the training goals. So what I mean by opponent, an example I was given was that if they were training scrimming against the team that they were playing early on in the competitive season and they wanted to get a mental edge over them, they might try to absolutely destroy them in that scrim, so that when they went into the competitive game in the first few weeks of training, they would know we've beaten these guys, and they would know that their opponents know that they've been beaten. The flip side of that, down at the 60%, was when they might be training a new strategy, or they were hiding their best strategies from a team that they might be playing in an upcoming round when they were training. They might just try the strategy, see what worked, see what didn't, and not care about the outcome of or beating their opponent in that scrim. It was more about perfecting that new strategy or effectively hiding their good strategies. Each one of these training sessions lasted up to about 6 hours per day. So there's a lot of training volume going into being an elite E athlete. Gaining knowledge. I kind of touched on this with reviewing their own footage and playing and watching. So with reviewing their own footage and then watching other players in different regions in their own region play, but mostly they were on the internet trying to find the newest strategies, the best way to play, the new tips and tricks. We're on YouTube, we're on Twitch, we're on Reddit, and we're on other game-specific sites where we're trying to pick up these new tips and tricks and stay with the meta and stay with the most successful strategies. Coming into teams, and the biggest challenge of an esports team, and I touched on this earlier in terms of stressors, is the interpersonal breakdown. So esports teams, all of the players reported employing team building activities to build team cohesion to buffer against interpersonal breakdowns. Interpersonal breakdowns seem to be such a big source of stress in esports and something we need to keep working on as both players and support staff. The coach-athlete relationship. So interestingly, the e-athletes that I interviewed say that their esports coaches were less holistic in their coaching. And what they meant by this was that it appears to them that in traditional sport, they have kind of a head coach that knows most things about most positions and most plays. And that's because that coach was either once a great player, or they have had 30, 40 years of research to build their coaching on. In esports, it appears that a lot of the coaching that was happening was more role-based. So they would bring in a really good jungler to help their jungler get better, or they'd bring in someone who's really good at just the meta game but not the micro skills associated with each character, or someone who is really good at a certain map or a certain site hold if we're talking R6. And they said that felt different to the relationships they'd have with coaches in traditional sports. That's interesting, something you might want to review if you're a coach or a team owner or org owner listening to this. One really important thing, and if you're a coach listening to this, is that players in elite teams look to you to set team standards and develop what is okay for the team and interpersonal communication. That is a burden that players are placing on you, or they're looking to you to set that team culture, set those team standards. So don't take that lightly, especially when one of the biggest stresses being reported is that interpersonal breakdown. And this could actually highlight that we need more research into esports coaching. So keep that in mind if you're a coach listening to this. And if you're a team owner listening to this, tell your coach this is something you need to set. If you're a player, be vulnerable, be open to your coach and go, this is something that I look to you to set. Moving on. So just a quick summary of those findings. They are more detailed in the paper, but just to quickly summarize them, from a mindset perspective, you need to be finding flow states. You need to be getting into deep states of focus, and you need to be confident. You need to believe in your training and believe in yourself. Team managers, support staff, sports psychologists, we need to work with teammate communication breakdowns. Elite athletes in this sample reported doing specific activities to build team cohesion and team connection, to buffer against those teammate breakdowns. If you're in a competitive team that's trying to push to that elite level, how are you implementing strategies and team building activities that are helping buffer against this breakdown of communication between players? It's so important. It's something we need to keep working with. That's just a general summary of the results. The paper outlines everything I've talked about. If this video wasn't enough, that's it. That's it, everyone. Thank you so much for sticking with me through these 5 videos. I really hope you've taken something away from this. It was 4 years of grueling research for me, and I'm still dedicated to researching it. I hope I've been able to give back. Just to summarize, we went through an introduction. What is stress? We talked about the sources of stress. We talked about the whole stress and coping process. We looked at how mental toughness could impact that stress and coping process and performance in esports. And we looked at the psychology of elite esports athletes. This is the final slide. This is my final thank you for coming along. If you have any questions, email me, reach out to me on Twitter, or leave a comment in the video below. Thank you so much. I hope you found this helpful. I'm committed to supporting esports athletes. And if you've enjoyed this video, please let me know. This is my first time doing a video series like this. So if there's something I could improve on, please also let me know in the comments below. Thank you so much. Look after yourselves and best of luck in esports.